Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for our witnesses today, especially our players. The state of college athletics, while imperfect, it's better today than it was 4 years ago. Now, it may not be better for the people who have historically benefited from the guise of amateurism, but it's certainly better for athletes. And those are the folks who have always created the value in this industry. But while I celebrate the progress, I remain concerned about the inequities that persist in college athletics. And with respect to NIL, I worry that universities' plan to finally share revenue directly with athletes could, again, shortchange women at a time when women's sports are seeing a massive surge in popularity. Mr. Whitman, are you aware of the tentative agreement in the House v. NCAA lawsuit that will require the NCAA to pay out nearly $2.8 billion in damages to current and former athletes dating back to 2016, with 75% going to football players, 15% for men's basketball players, 5% for women basketball players, and 5% for all other athletes?
I am aware, yes.
I figured. Then you, and great, I wouldn't expect any other answer. You must also be familiar with the filing in that case by Barbara Osborne, an independent Title IX specialist with extensive experience auditing collegiate institutions who studied the House settlement terms. If the lopsided terms of the House settlement were used in an institution, Ms. Osborne claimed she would have advised the institution that they were violating Title IX. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter Ms. Osborne's report on the gender inequities present in the House settlement's revenue model into the record. Thank you. Mr. Whitman, you advocate that Congress codify a revenue-sharing framework that is, and I'm quoting here from your testimony, largely in line with what is contemplated by the House settlement. Your testimony comes amid reports that Power 5 schools like the University of Georgia are already planning to use those same thresholds in their future revenue-sharing model scheduled to take effect later this year. Mr. Whitman, can you understand why many current and former women athletes like myself are alarmed that NCAA institutions and leaders are adopting a revenue-sharing model that only gives women, at most, 10%?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And this is an issue that has weighed heavily on our campuses as we have tried to evaluate how to apply, excuse me, a 50-year-old law to a new set of facts that weren't contemplated when that law was passed. And we have worked very earnestly to consult with a variety of different counsel to gain some clarity on that issue, and all that we have learned through those conversations is there seems to be some lack of consensus around exactly how that law will apply to these new opportunities that we can make available to our student athletes. What we know is that we're seeing an explosion in popularity in women's sports. We know that people who work in college athletics remain very strong champions of advancement in amongst our women's teams. But we also see that we are faced with some really challenging balancing of equities in a case like this one. If we were to apply Title IX in the sense that of the traditional financial aid balancing proportionality, we would potentially be diverting money away from the athletes who generate that revenue, many of whom are student athletes of color, many of whom come from underprivileged backgrounds. On the flip side, we understand that if we were to maintain those revenues with the student athletes who generate it, we wouldn't be potentially passing as much of it along to our female student athletes. And so it creates a really challenging dynamic for us to navigate on campus. Which
is why I asked that question, because as you're aware in your role as Director of Athletics, Title IX requires that if a school awards financial assistance to athletes, they must, quote, provide reasonable opportunities for such awards for members of each sex in proportion to the number of students of each sex participating in interscholastic or intercollegiate athletics, end quote. Surely the model that Georgia and other schools plan to use cannot comply with Title IX.
We don't think that's been identified or established. We think there's a lack of clarity around how Title IX will apply to these new payments. We currently comply with Title IX. We're required to comply with Title IX. We have every intention of continuing to comply
Well, at a
with
time
Title
when women haven't seen their fair market value because they've never had the benefit of promotion or boosting, at a time when women's fandom of college sports is surging, I would hope that we would not base forward-looking frameworks for how we're going to distribute those revenues based on a model where women were shortchanged. So I thank you for the extra time, Mr. Chairman, and I yield.